The wind howled through the desolate forest, bending the trees into twisted shapes as if they were writhing in agony. The full moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the landscape, illuminating the long-forgotten road that led deep into the heart of the woods. A lone car rumbled along the cracked pavement, its headlights flickering against the creeping mist that clung to the ground like grasping fingers. Inside the car, James tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His heart pounded against his ribs as he stole a glance at his fiancée, Claire, beside him. She was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. The tension between them had been palpable since they'd left the city. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks prior, a thick envelope sealed with wax, bearing only the name Blackwood Manor in elegant script. No return address, no explanation, just a date and an order, come alone. James had wanted to throw it away, to ignore the eerie summons, but Claire had insisted they go. It's probably a joke, she'd said, or maybe some distant relative left you an inheritance. James wasn't so sure. His family history was a blank slate, a past erased before he was born. His parents had died when he was a child, leaving him to be raised by foster families. He had no memories of any Blackwood Manor, and yet something about the name sent a chill down his spine. The road narrowed until the trees pressed in on either side. Then, without warning, the forest opened up to reveal the mansion. It loomed ahead, an ancient relic of stone and decay. Towering spires jutted into the night sky, their windows dark like vacant eyes. The wrought iron gate stood open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest as the wind nudged it to and fro. This place is straight out of a horror movie, Claire murmured. James swallowed. Yeah, let's make this quick. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path as they approached the massive oak doors. A brass knocker, shaped like a snarling wolf's head, gleamed in the dim light. James hesitated before lifting it and letting it fall. The sound echoed through the manor, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the doors creaked open of their own accord, revealing a cavernous foyer lit by flickering chandeliers. Dust motes danced in the air, and the scent of aged wood and something sickly sweet filled their nostrils. "Hello," Claire called out. No response. James stepped inside first, his pulse hammering. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes following him as he moved. The faces were unfamiliar. Stern men, solemn women, all dressed in Victorian attire. Then his breath caught in his throat. At the end of the hall, a massive painting hung above the fireplace. It depicted a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy. The man bore an uncanny resemblance to James. Same sharp jawline, same piercing blue eyes. Claire noticed it too. "James, that's you." A chill skittered down his spine. No, it can't be. But before he could say another word, a voice whispered from the shadows. "Welcome home." James spun around, but there was no one there. Just the dark, empty hall stretching before them. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest. Then the whispering began. It came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air itself. A chorus of voices, overlapping, murmuring, chanting. The words were indecipherable, yet they sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. Claire clutched his arm. "James, we need to leave. Now." He turned back toward the door, only to find it closed. He lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, rising to an almost unbearable pitch. Then the lights flickered and the manor came to life. The chandelier swayed as though caught in an unseen storm. Shadows slithered along the walls, stretching and contorting into nightmarish shapes. A gust of frigid air howled through the corridors, carrying with it the sound of footsteps. Not one pair, many. James pulled Claire close, his breath shallow. "Who's there?" A voice, soft and lilting, whispered in his ear. "You don't remember, do you?" He turned sharply, but the hall was empty. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. She was tall and gaunt, her skin pale as death. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and a slow, skeletal grin spread across her lips. Her dress, tattered and faded, dragged against the floor as she stepped closer. "You belong here, James," she cooed. "You've always belonged here." A memory surged forth, flashes of childhood he'd long forgotten. Running through these very halls, a woman's laughter, then the screams, the fire, the overwhelming scent of burning flesh. James staggered back. "No, I don't." But the whispers had turned to wails. Hands, cold, skeletal, shot from the darkness, grabbing at his limbs. Claire screamed as they pulled her away, her fingers slipping from his grasp. James fought, kicking, struggling, but the shadows swallowed him whole. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the woman's smile, her teeth sharp as razors. Then nothing. The next morning, the Blackwood Manor was gone. The road where it had stood was empty, nothing but tangled woods and silence. A single car remained on the abandoned road, its doors flung open, its headlights still on. Of James and Claire, there was no sign. Only the wind whispered their names. Now, let's continue listening to the next story. The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in mystery, a place where the shadows stretched a little too long and the wind carried whispers of things unseen. Nestled deep in the woods, it was the kind of town where people locked their doors before dusk and never dared to look out their windows past midnight. They knew better. For centuries, a legend had loomed over Black Hollow, the tale of the Veil Walker. No one knew where the legend began, but everyone knew how it ended, with the disappearance of those who ignored the warnings. The Veil Walker was said to be neither alive nor dead, a figure trapped between realms, forever seeking to replace its lost soul with another. Carter Hayes had never believed in such nonsense. A city-born journalist, he had come to Black Hollow for a story. A series of mysterious disappearances had been reported in the town over the past few months, and Carter was determined to uncover the truth behind them. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a creaking wooden structure surrounded by towering pines. His first few days in Black Hollow were uneventful. The locals were tight-lipped, their eyes filled with unspoken warnings. It wasn't until the fourth night that things began to shift. That night, the air was thick with an eerie stillness, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Carter was at his desk, reviewing his notes, when he heard it, the sound of footsteps outside his window. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Shaking off his unease, he returned to his work. But then there was again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. He stood, moving cautiously to the window. The glass was fogged from his breath, but beyond it, something moved between the trees. A shadow, tall, thin, and shifting unnaturally, as though it wasn't entirely bound by the laws of this world. Carter's breath caught in his throat. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The next morning, Carter visited the town's records office, searching for any information on the legend of the Veil Walker. What he found was chilling. Old newspaper clippings detailing unexplained disappearances dating back over 100 years. Each case had eerie similarities. Witnesses describing figures in the woods, strange whispers in the night, and in some cases, messages scrawled onto mirrors in a language no one understood. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Carter decided to spend the following night in the woods with his camera, hoping to capture evidence of whatever haunted Black Hollow. Armed with a flashlight and a recorder, he set off just before midnight, the town's church bells tolling ominously as he entered the dense thicket. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just silence. A deep, oppressive silence that made his skin crawl. He walked deeper, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then he heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, carried by the wind. Carter, he froze. The voice had been clear, unmistakable. His name, but no one knew he was here. Swallowing his fear, he pressed forward, his camera rolling. Then he saw it. A figure stood among the trees, barely visible through the fog. Its limbs were elongated, its face a shifting void. It didn't move, but Carter could feel it watching him. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over him, and his legs felt rooted to the ground. They began to move. Not walking, not running, gliding, shifting, as though it was flickering between this world and another. Carter stumbled back, his heart pounding. The figure came closer, and with it, the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around him. A guttural whisper filled his ears. "Your soul is mine." Carter turned and ran, his breath ragged, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his grip. The trees seemed to close in, the path twisting in unnatural ways. No matter which way he turned, he could still hear it, right behind him. Then he tripped. The ground rushed up to meet him, knocking the air from his lungs. Desperate, he scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The figure loomed over him now, its face impossibly close. Carter felt a cold hand brush against his skin, and then darkness. The next morning, Carter's cabin was found empty, his belongings untouched, his car still parked outside. But he was gone. The only thing left was his recorder, lying on the forest floor, its tape still running. The townsfolk listened, their faces pale as they heard his final words. "It's here." Then a whisper barely audible, a voice not his own. More will come, and they did, because the story of Black Hollow spread. People came, seeking the truth, and one by one, they vanished. The Veil Walker always finds its next soul. Now, let's continue listening to the next story. The house had stood on Hollow Creek Road for over a century, its once proud Victorian facade now hidden behind vines and decay. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones, calling it the Weeping House. They said no one who spent a night inside ever left the same. It was a cold October evening when Daniel, a skeptical paranormal investigator, arrived at the house. He had made a name for himself debunking ghost stories, and this house would be no different. Armed with his camera, voice recorder, and flashlight, he stepped through the warped front door. The air inside was thick, damp with the scent of mold and something fouler, something rotten. The wooden floor groaned beneath his boots. As he scanned the dusty hall, his light flickered. He dismissed it as faulty wiring and pressed on. He set up his equipment in the parlor, placing the recorder on a rickety coffee table. "If there's anyone here, make yourself known." Silence. He exhaled, shaking his head. It was always the same, an old house, some local legends, and nothing more. He reached for his recorder, but then, a soft sob. It was distant, almost imperceptible. He froze, listening. The sobbing grew louder, coming from upstairs. Daniel's stomach twisted. It wasn't the sound itself that disturbed him, but its unnatural quality, like multiple voices crying in unison, harmonizing in misery. He grabbed his flashlight and ascended the staircase. Each step sent echoes through the house, as though it was breathing beneath him. The sobbing led him to the end of a long, dark hallway, where a door stood ajar. Pushing it open, he found an old nursery. The wallpaper peeled like dead skin, revealing rotting wood beneath. A child's rocking horse sat motionless in the center of the room, its glass eyes gleaming in the dim light. Then, the crying stopped. Daniel shivered as an eerie silence took its place. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. He lunged forward, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His breath quickened. Then came the whispers. At first, just one voice. Then another. Then dozens. They murmured in overlapping tones, weaving a tapestry of despair. "Help us. Please don't leave. He's coming." Daniel spun, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The rocking horse began to sway, creaking with each slow movement. A shadow loomed in the corner, stretching and distorting as if it had a life of its own. Then, a laugh, deep, guttural, and inhuman. The room plunged into icy darkness, his flashlight flickering wildly. A force slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. He gasped as cold fingers wrapped around his ankle, dragging him toward the shadows. He kicked, clawed, desperate to break free. And then, light. The flashlight flickered back to life, revealing an empty room. The whispers ceased. The door creaked open. Daniel bolted, rushing down the stairs. But the house wasn't done with him. As he reached the front door, it swung open by itself. He didn't question it. He ran. Outside, the air felt clean, free from the oppressive weight of the house. He turned back, expecting to see it looming in the night. But instead, he saw something far worse. A figure stood in the window, watching him. Not one, many. Dozens of hollow-eyed faces peered through the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. And there, in the center, the tallest figure of all, smiling. The house wanted him back, and deep down, Daniel knew it wouldn't be long before it got what it wanted.